So now we've scaled out our ingredients. We're ready to do our egg bread. So egg bread is a rich bread. The other doughs that we did, the French bread, that was a basic 4 dough. So it doesn't have any fat in it. This has fat in it. It has the fat in the form of the eggs and the butter both. So the texture on this dough is going to be a little bit different. But kind of like the French bread that we've already done, the order that you put everything in doesn't really matter a whole lot. It's not super critical as long as you're not putting the salt and the yeast together. Now, the recipe in the reader calls for active dry yeast, and it also calls for you to have warm milk and to bloom the yeast in the milk. So we're using instant yeast. You don't have to do that. Just scale out everything, and then I'll show you how to combine everything to put it in the mixer so we get a good homogeneous dough. All right, so here's my mise en place right here. So I'm going to take my salt and put it in my flour just right off the bat. And I have this little whisk here. I'm just going to combine that really well. That way I distribute it in the flour really well. Yeah. Try not to make a mess. All right. So next thing I'm going to do is I have my yeast. And I'm going to combine my yeast in my milk, but this milk is not warm. I know the recipe calls for warm, but again, this is instant yeast, and it doesn't need to be warm. We're not blooming the yeast. The yeast will be fine. And the reason I put it in here with the milk, it's the same reason I put the salt in the flour, is to help distribute it well so that when we put them all together, everything is evenly distributed throughout the dough. So I do the same thing. I'm going to do the same thing with the salt. I mean, the sugar and the eggs. Eggs, even if there's no sugar, I always will break up eggs that are going into a bread dough. Otherwise, sometimes the dough hook chases the eggs around and it doesn't really break them. It takes them a while and you end up over mixing. So I break up the eggs. I'll put in my sugar. Be sure that you stir this right away. If you just put sugar on top of eggs and let it sit, that sugar is going to start to clump together and it's not going to come apart. So I am going to put in, this is my milk first. And again, you can put the dry ingredients in first. It's not super critical. So here's my eggs and my sugar. That's going in as well. I'm going to go ahead and lift it up. Turn it on for just a second. I just wanted to turn it on just to mix it a little bit. So now I'm just going to take this all in one shot. That's my flour. All right, that's pretty good. So I'm going to turn it on low speed. I don't know if you can hear me over the mixer, so I'm going to stop the mixer for a second. You want to do this part on low speed. We don't start timing the dough until the dough has already come together as a homogeneous mass. That's when, if a recipe says mix on 3rd speed for 10 minutes, they're talking about after the dough comes together. That's what they mean. You put it on low, you mix everything, it comes together, it starts to look like a bread dough. That's when we start the clock. All right, so push some of the dry down in there. It's one of my complaints about this KitchenAid is the dough hook doesn't reach down far enough, so you might have to stop it once or twice. So now I'm starting to hear the machine pull a little bit. The dough has come together. It's not fully formed yet, but it does have that central mass, and you can see that it's starting to stretch. So at this point, I would look at the clock and I would make a mental note of what time it is, and I would turn it up to your mix speed. Depending on your mixer, you're going to have either a KitchenAid, or you might have a Global or something different. I don't know what you have. But even the recipe, though the recipe might say second speed, what they mean is medium. So we mix it on a low speed. If you have a 3-speed machine, that's 2. If you have a 10-speed machine, that's 5 or 6. So it's a medium speed that we're going to mix it in. This dough takes, I don't know, about 8 or 9 minutes, even in a mixer like this. So we're going to start the mixing now. I'm going to let it run. In the last 2 minutes of mixing, I'm going to stop the mixer. That's when I'm going to put in my butter. And then I'm going to let it mix with the butter in it the last 2 minutes of mixing, because I want the gluten and the strands to develop first before I put in the butter, because the fat will interrupt the gluten development. All right, so let's get into mixing.